Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. I wanted to do a video on a topic that has kind of been going around the horse industry a lot recently since the court case documents were released. And in my opinion, it's a really shining example of just how accepted horse abuse is in the horse community and how these types of things can happen and go entirely unpunished, and where horse people can treat horses with immense cruelty and then still maintain their careers and still be an active member of the horse community and actively harming horses in the process. And it's just a really unfortunate thing. So what happened recently is it became more common knowledge that this trainer down in South Carolina by the name of Shannon Eckel killed a horse. And I'm gonna have a massive trigger warning for the information that I'm gonna share because there are photos. So for anyone who is squeamish or doesn't want to hear about a horse that has died due to the abuse of a trainer, big heads up, I would skip forward a couple of minutes. So this trainer, Shannon Eckel, had a horse by the name of Cobain. The horse would not load in the trailer when she was taking this horse to the show. So as a form of punishment, she tied this horse in his stall to the top rail of the stall, the frame of the stall, and left him there with his head tied up quite high. And he was tied in a rope halter, and it was just tied directly to the metal frame of the stall. So there's no breakaway tie. She then left to go to the competition and left the horse there by himself unattended for hours. Someone else came and found the scene of the horse who had broken his neck and separated the cervical vertebrae in his neck and had also knocked loose several teeth on his bottom jaw. I'm going to show photos. Huge trigger warning again. It's really unpleasant to see. So just heads up. Anyways, the horse was found by someone else and photos were taken by those people. Shannon tried to lie to the owner of the horse and say that he'd cast himself and just basically make the accident out to be something different than it actually was as a means of trying to evade accountability. She was part of a civil court case, which I think has been settled. So civil court isn't criminal court. There's no criminal charges. She's not been charged with animal abuse. She's still actively training and competing. This is part of the problem because in a case like this, as far as I'm concerned, there's no reason why someone shouldn't be held legally accountable from a criminal perspective for animal abuse. It's not just a freak accident. This was a decided choice to do something extremely irresponsible with a high risk of danger without any regard for the horse's safety. And she made the choice to do that knowingly because you can't really be a trainer and not be aware of the fact that leaving a horse tied, even if they're in a breakaway halter and tied to a breakaway tie, leaving a horse tied unattended for hours at a time is such a high risk. They're flight animals. If they panic and they're tied up, they're going to fight the tie, and it can be a huge problem, especially when you have them hard tied like this. The other thing to note is that tying a horse like this as a form of punishment in general is just really unethical and cruel. Even if the horse hadn't hurt himself or killed himself, he's not going to associate not loading in the trailer with the act of being tied. It happens way too long after the undesirable behavior. So it is essentially just a trainer throwing a temper tantrum, taking it out on the horse and making it the horse's problem, which is just incredibly unfair. The other thing that I want to note in light of all of this is that this is just an example where a trainer has done something like this, where it has actually resulted in measurable harm. So the horse died and there's photos of it and there is presence of harm. There are lots of horses who are hard tied on a regular basis and trainers who who swear by this as a method where they will tie horses to posts with no breakaway and just watch them pull back and fight back and use that as a means of teaching them how to tie. Because when horses panic enough and they fight and they fight and they cannot get loose, you get a response called learned helplessness when they realize that they cannot free themselves from the situation and they'll just go into this freeze state and stop fighting. So for people who are lazy trainers, they'll take that learned helpless state and go, well, see, now they tie, and they'll stand tied almost robotically, but they're not tying because they've actually learned anything. They're just so terrified in the situation that they have stopped fighting. It's not real training. It's not ethical training. And in the event of another major stressor that kind of wakes the horse up out of that state, you can have the same pullback response that can be incredibly dangerous. So essentially what it does is it creates a ticking ticking time bomb. But this is a method that a lot of trainers swear by. And even when I did a post on Facebook about this issue with Shannon Eckel, a bunch of people were still commenting on that post being like, it's awful what she did, but hard tying has a place. The patient's pole has a place. And people want to separate this incident where the horse died from the very real risk that they take by hard tying their horses. As far as I'm concerned, there is no reason to hard tie a horse because a horse who ties well should be able to tie to anything and not break it. If your horse actually knows how to tie, you should be able to tie it to a piece of twine and it's not going to break it. Twine is present everywhere in every barn because we feed so much hay. Everyone has twine. You can also buy like a blocker tie ring, or you can buy one of those, I think they're called like equiping or something. It's like a plastic tie ring that'll undo if the horse pulls back far enough. You can buy those very easily and you could bring them everywhere with you on your trail, in your saddlebag if you're trail riding. There is no reason to hard tie a horse, especially if we're referencing hard tying them with a non-breakaway halter and to something that will not break. At the bare minimum, every horse owner out there can afford a breakaway halter and can tie in a breakaway halter. If you're not willing to do that or don't want to because you're worried about the halter breaking and your horse getting loose, then just bring a piece of twine. But the fact of the matter is if you make the choice to tie your horse to a solid object in a halter that will not break, you are taking the risk of this happening. And people will go off and they'll be like, well, my horse actually ties well. They'll never do that. That's not a big risk. It doesn't matter how well your horse ties. All it takes is an accident. There's horses who have been in wash stalls that have slipped and fallen. And if they're hard tied and they cannot get their legs back under themselves, they're just hanging from their head. And similarly, if they're tied and like, let's say a tree falls down or something explodes or there's thunder in the distance or some major stressor happens, even the most bomb-proof horse can panic and then you have a major problem. What if there's an earthquake? What if there's some type of disaster that you want your horse to be able to break free from? And if they tie so reliably and well in every other circumstance, then you don't have to worry about that happening unless there's actually a real need for them to get loose because they're not going to be panicking and trying to break free. The logic that horses who tie well should be able to hard tie makes no sense because a horse who ties well is not going to break a breakaway tie, and therefore it is no risk to the person tying that horse to tie it to a breakaway tie because they're not going to break it. I will not tie my horses to anything where they cannot get free if something were to happen, and they always wear a breakaway halter even when they're not tied because I just don't want the risk of having them have an accident if their halter didn't. It's one of those things where it's like, why would you want to wait until a really bad accident happens? And there's been situations where I've seen this happen with horses, where I've had people contact me with stories where their trainer hard tied a horse and they watch the horse struggle and panic and ultimately break its neck. There's also a lot of cases, if you talk to body workers, where horses have survived pulling back but have permanent damage to the neck. There's also a number of equine professionals who do dissections on horses after they pass who have found significant damage to the cervical spine from pulling back injuries. So even if your horse does not die, you can give them permanent damage to their neck that may alter their behavior, alter their comfort, alter their capacity to do things. And while you cannot see the damage, it is still present. So it begs the question, why is this worth the risk? Why are so many horse people, even in the presence of an example of heinous abuse, willing to defend the very method that resulted in the horse dying? Because there's so many trainers that swear by the patient's pull method and hard tying, and they want to be able to do so without actually having to answer to what their advocacy for that method actually says about them and the risks that they're willing to put forth for their horse. It's just, it doesn't make any sense. And I wanted to bring this up because I think it's important for people to consider the fact that you cannot separate yourself from the risks that you're willing to take. You're just operating with the belief that something isn't going to happen. And until something does, you're going to continue maintaining that belief. And it's not responsible training if you're willing to take risks and do something that is inherently more risky to cause physical damage or death when there's an abundance of alternative methods that you could use to do the very same thing. You do not need to teach a horse to tie in this way. You do not need to tie horses who already know how to tie in this way. There are a lot of alternatives. And I get frustrated hearing horse people try to frame it as if there aren't alternatives, as if this is the only way that they can do things. And they'll make up all sorts of excuses. But realistically, it's like if you don't have to take this risk, which I would argue in basically 100% of cases, but for the sake of being fair, let's say in 90% of cases, if you don't have to hard tie your horse 90% of the time, why wouldn't you make sure that they're in a breakaway halter or tied to something that will break that 90% of the time? Because then you're mitigating risk substantially. Why take more risk than you need to? It is not worth it. I want to bring up something that happened with a client horse who I absolutely loved. One of my favorite horses ever. The best horse. No issues tying, such a good boy, really lovely to handle. Didn't set a foot wrong. When his owner wasn't present, he was in cross ties in a nylon halter for farrier work. And while the farrier was trimming him, he somehow lost his balance and fell forward in the cross ties, but couldn't get his legs back underneath of him. So he hung from the cross ties from his head and neck for a few seconds, probably under a minute, before the farrier was able to cut him free and make sure that he got loose. And just from that small amount of time hanging like that, he irreparably damaged his body and had a ruptured brainstem that later had to result in him being euthanized because he basically had a slow brain bleed. And it was a really tragic situation that would have been completely avoidable had he not been hard tied to the cross ties in a nylon halter. A breakaway halter or breakaway ties that the cross ties could have been attached to would have made that situation not happen. So it's a devastating, awful situation that you cannot undo. And it's a situation where the horse had that injury, not because he pulled back and panicked while tied, but because he just lost balance. And like that's a great example of a freak accident that could happen to any horse. It does not matter how well they tie. When you decide to hard tie a horse, that is the risk you're taking. And I think more people need to hold themselves accountable for their willingness to take that risk. It was incredible to me how many people doubled down and continued to defend their right to hard tie and make up all these ridiculous excuses, none of which actually made any real sense because their entire argument for hard tying was that they didn't want their horses to get loose. But then in the same breath, they were saying, my horse ties so well that they won't pull back. So then it's like, if you don't want them to get loose, they're not going to get loose if you tie them to twine because they don't pull back. So do they pull back or don't they? Where's the logic here? But anyways, the point I want to make is that with horses, there's a certain level of mistreatment, cruelty, and general lack of responsibility on the part of horse owners and trainers that is accepted. And even when horses die due to the negligence on the part of trainers, people still double down and defend the same types of methods that resulted in that negligence that caused the death of the horse. We feel entitled to doing things that are inherently endangering horses, and people want to do that without judgment and without actually having to answer to what the risks they're willing to take say about them as a trainer and rider. Similarly, there is a lack of enforcement of animal welfare regulations in general across the board for all animals, but especially with horses. The level of abuse that is justified for handling horses compared to, let's say, dogs is absolutely ridiculous. People can beat horses out in the public eye, put it on video, proudly post it all over TikTok, and people will like these videos and they'll get millions of likes, hundreds of thousands of likes, tons of hits, and people will double down and continue to defend these methods that are caught on video that show such cruelty. There is a sickness in the horse industry. There is a lack of empathy in the horse industry, and we really need to start zeroing in and addressing it because these really extreme forms of abuse that result in horses dying or being severely injured don't start that severe. They're slowly brought along by people normalizing a certain amount of negligence, a certain amount of lack of empathy, a certain amount of harshness, and then it snowballs into these bigger things where people completely lose their shit on horses and lose their patience and end up doing things that are way, way worse. But it starts small. So these smaller abuses and things that people shrug off as not being as big of a deal, they inevitably lead to the lack of empathy and the lack of self-reflection self-reflection that emboldens people into being an extremely abusive person. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It starts small and it builds. I remember how I was taught to handle horses growing up, and I did not want to hit them initially. But over time, after having it increasingly more normalized to me and seeing my role models do these things to horses and being told that it was necessary in order to create a well-behaved horse, I learned to handle them in a way that was not fair to them. And I started to do things that I never would have been okay with in the beginning. And that's how abuse starts. So we need to actually start to address the elephant in the room, because the amount of horse abuse that is freely shared online is just the tip of the iceberg. Because even those really bold trainers who are openly sharing such forms of cruelty, they have a limit where they know that there's certain things that they cannot freely share online and that wouldn't look good. So if you look at what someone is willing to share online and then reflect on what is going on under the surface, that they draw the line and they go, I shouldn't share that. You can guarantee that what goes on behind the scenes is a lot worse than what they post online, because everyone is putting their best foot forward online. The other thing too is that when trainers post videos of them handling horses in really unfair ways and defend it, that's also a huge part of the problem, where there's no self-reflection. Even when exposed to information regarding why what they're doing isn't necessarily the best or the most ethical, a lot of people double down and continue defending it, and then they get tons of people within their circle that are willing to do the same, and it essentially makes them more stuck in their ways. And that's the biggest thing. It's not that people can't ever make mistakes, especially if they've been taught to be rough from a young age. But how do they respond when they're corrected? Do they double down and refuse to consider any other perspective and refuse to consider how it's affecting the horse? Or are they more considerate, and do they kind of take a pause and go, okay, wait a second? Because that's what we need. We need to have an industry full of people where, even if they don't always do the right thing, where there's more willingness to be like, okay, wait a second, I didn't consider how this might make the horse feel, and then changing. There is a huge lack of self-reflection, accountability, and empathy in the horse world. There's a huge amount of ego and lack of willingness to reflect, and a lack of emotional regulation. And people really need to start addressing that, because we have full-grown adults that are taking out their anger on horses instead of going and taking a break and coming back when they're more emotionally regulated. And that lack of emotional regulation leads people to getting to the point of anger where they're lashing out at the horses in a big way and then causing major problems. The last thing I want to say about the situation with Shannon Eckel is that one of her old working students did a video where they shared that they saw a lot of instances where she was being incredibly abusive to the horses, and that the horses were very afraid of her, and that she would do things like hard tying them with like a fence behind them, and then they'd be tied to a trailer, and she'd be beating the crap out of them with a whip while they panicked, to the point where like one horse in particular flipped over a fence and broke the fence multiple times. She also stated that she would often tie them up and leave them tied like that while she went to shows, and leave them tied for hours, so that it was a recurring thing. And I want to emphasize that in particular, because since she did it repeatedly, it started to feel normal for her to do that. And it probably felt safe to her to do that to the horses, where she'd done it enough times that she was getting apathetic and she wasn't considering the actual risk that she was undertaking by doing that. And this is the same thing that all of these trainers that I'm referencing with the hard tying are doing. They're apathetic towards the amount of risk that they're taking. And until they get a big wake up call that usually comes in a way where you can't go back once the wake up call happens, because the horse is either permanently injured or dead, they're not going to learn until that point. But we shouldn't be letting stuff get to that point before people actually learn. It is so irresponsible. We need to do so much better. Horses are such docile, patient, and kind animals, and in return, so many horse people are so awful to them. We need to do better. And honestly, if authorities aren't going to hold people legally accountable for their behavior, as a community, as an industry, we should be making it clear that people like Shannon Eckel are not welcome in the industry, that they can't just gloss over what they did to horses, like in her case with killing Cobain, and just come back and continue competing as if nothing happened. That they're not welcome until there's a clear example of self-reflection and changed behavior. And honestly, in her case, since she killed a horse, it begs the question, does someone like that even deserve another chance? But since she never even had to take a break to reflect on her behavior or have any part of her career be taken away from her, then that begs the question, how can someone like that learn? Because she's been able to continue practicing as if nothing happened and she's still been showing up at shows. And while people in the local community are aware of it hasn't impacted her in a big enough way where she hasn't been able to continue doing what she's doing. So, as a community, we need to have a no tolerance for abuse, and we actually need to stand by it with our actions for ourselves instead of looking at people like Shannon and going, oh, well, she killed a horse, but I'm not going to, even though I'm doing basically the same thing by hard tying. We can do better, and we shouldn't tolerate stuff like this because there are so many insidious forms of abuse in the horse world that culminate until you get people like Shannon. And there's a lot of people who are just like her that are operating under the surface in covert ways and are enabled in doing so because their mindsets and ideologies that lead them to using these types of really cruel methods are openly accepted in the horse world. And it's not surprising to me that something like this happened because so many people justify doing the same thing. Look on TikTok and see how many videos there are of people using the patience pull method and having horses pull back and freak out while hard tied. Look at companies that are offering halters like the Be Nice halter or I think it's like Rockin' A or Rockin' Leather Company that has a halter that constricts over the cervical vertebrae of the horse and tightens when they're pulling back. So it's essentially amplifying the effect of pulling back. And they're selling that as a halter to stop horses from pulling back. They actually blocked me yesterday because I shared their post where they were advertising the halter about permanently fixing pulling back. And I said, hey, let's crowdfund x-raying all of these horses who've worn these halters their neck. I will pay for it. Let's get people to chip in and we can crowdfund paying for these horses' neck x-rays. And then we can determine whether or not it is actually harmless and whether or not it's actually resolving the problem in a healthy and kind, or definitely not kind, but in a healthy way that's not without damage. The company messaged me before blocking me and they said, there is no debate. Pulling back is harmful. That's why the behavior needs to be fixed. You have no point here. It doesn't matter what they pull back in. Fix the behavior. I agree that the behavior should be fixed. What I disagree with is that it needs to be fixed by in a way where you're adding to the amount of damage that is happening to the horse's neck. It is a dangerous behavior, but that doesn't mean that you should add to the danger by amplifying the amount of pressure that the horse is pulling back on their neck. And the fact that they blocked me over just saying that I wanted to x-ray the necks of the horses who've worn their halter, to me tells me that they freaking know damn well that there's a high chance that it is not healthy or safe for those horses to wear them. And this is a company that's advertising a product to try to solve an issue when really they could just be creating more problems amongst the owners of those horses. And that is still so normalized in the community, and they have a lot of people advertising that halter for them. So if we want to see stuff like this not happen, instead of being like, boo boo, Shannon Eccles, she is the worst, what a villain, what a monster, look at all of the other monsters that are directly in front of you doing the same thing. And don't wait until they kill a horse before you condemn their behavior, because the reason why people like Shannon exist is because their behavior is justified and defended by the masses in the horse industry. And no one really cares about what they're doing until there is provable harm. And by provable harm, it usually means a dead horse or a horse with a severe injury that is actually physically visible. Because when it's an injury under the surface that just changes behavior or changes their ability to bend their neck, etc., people just blame the horse and call them quirky, or they want to tie their head to their side to help them learn how to bend more and do all sorts of other messed up shit to try to address the behavior instead of considering the fact that maybe there might be an underlying body issue. So I am sick and tired of the virtue signaling where a lot of people will be all about horse welfare in events like this where something severe happens, but then their actual actions and behavior all the other time isn't reflective of actually trying to stop the very types of behaviors that result in the deaths of horses like Cobain. So thank you for coming to my TED Talk. If you don't want your horse to end up like doornail behind me there, don't fucking hard tie it. Thank you. And have a good day, everybody. And don't hard tie your horses. It's lazy. If a pole can replace you in training, you're not a real trainer, and you need to like stop being lazy and actually work with your horses instead of just tying a knot and piecing it. If you can't tell, this is like one of my the hills that I'll die on, and it pisses me off so much. But thank you for watching and supporting my content. Let me know your thoughts down below, and I love hearing from all of you. And to Shannon Eckel, I hope you have some terrible days ahead of you, because that is horrendous. And I really hope you struggle to sleep at night. I hope you lose all your clients. And I hope that if you're not held legally accountable for what you did, you'll be held karmically accountable for it. And as you should. I hope you feel terrible every day, because what the fuck? That is an insane thing to do. And it's just, what a horrendous person. And everyone else who is just like her but hasn't killed a horse yet, I hope that you learn your lesson before you actually have to kill a horse or severely injure one. And I hope that you do things in a nicer way, because it's just so unnecessary. But anyways, thank you for watching, and I hope everyone has a good day, except for people who abuse horses. They can get fucked.